this was going to be a difficult G20. We knew that discussions would be impacted by the political context of war in Ukraine. And developments over the last few hours showed once again the very sensitive character of the current situation. In this connection, over the last hours and a few minutes ago, I spoke to the Polish authorities. I expressed my condolences, our condolences for the victims of missile strikes that struck the Polish territory yesterday. I said we were with them, and I said that we were committed to be with Poland, supporting Poland, so that we can know absolutely what took place during those strikes. Investigations are taking place. We are cooperating with Poland to know what took place, and we are doing this with all of our allies, which we met today, this morning. I spoke to President Zelensky. He spoke on 2 occasions during the G20, and I said that we wanted to help them for all those damages, especially those taking place yesterday. There were between 80 and 100 Russian missiles that were sent to civilians and on civilian structures, which shows this is a very violent moment of the war, and a moment where we meet, this was a very clear message sent by Russia. As I said, we made a decision. We have convictions. We've had those convictions for the last few months. We don't want to divide the world. This is not a G20 summit deciding on peace or stopping a war, but at least we had one responsibility. We had to send a very clear message to prevent any escalation, to defend peace, and to prevent the division of the world. In this connection, I believe that in spite of our different opinions, it is a clear message that was sent to the international community and that was sent in particular to Russia. So, the first conclusion of the summit, an important conclusion, is that G20 did not ignore war in Ukraine, quite the other way around. We sent a number of proposals, and it shows that there is a reason for agreement, especially with major emerging countries such as China and Russia, and that is to push Russia to de-escalation. This is very much what France defended during the General Assembly of the United Nations a few weeks ago. Even though President Putin did not come, the message sent by the major economies is very clear. Most members of the G20 condemned the war in Ukraine. That is a fact. And we saw that during the vote of the last resolution of the United Nations. And going beyond this, there is a joint declaration that includes India and China. And it says that faced with the multiplication of a global crisis, the G20 doesn't want war, doesn't want nuclear blackmail, which it deems inadmissible. The G20 is first and foremost an economic cooperation venue. Well, all its members want to affirm international law. As I mentioned on a number of occasions, we want to comply with this international law. This is what is at stake in the Ukrainian war. On the sidelines of the summit, very clearly, after the liberation of Kherson, we saw that lines are moving. We had the opportunity to talk with the Chinese president, and he showed clearly that he wanted to come out clearly against any nuclear escalation. And also, we could go into the details of the situation. China can be with us and play a role of a mediator, more of a role in the next few months, especially to prevent any escalation of stronger attacks on land starting in February. I talked to President Xi Jinping on this issue, as well as on the principle of a visit early in 2023, a visit of Peking, so that we can strengthen our dialogue on those key issues. I also spoke with Prime Minister Modi a few hours ago on a very clear line, more cooperation. There is a lot of goodwill, and we want them to mediate with Russia. Also, we should intensify the dialogue with other G20 partners. That is the goal of the meeting that we had on Monday night, prior to the official opening of the G20. We met with Senegal, President Macky Sall, who's also president of the African Union, Rwanda, South Africa, Argentina, Mexico, to once again bring people together in agreement. And so that from our countries, we see a clear message to Russia to stop that war and to comply with international law. On this issue, the G20 was useful. We are by and large in agreement. We could broaden this coalition for peace, and this is a diplomatic work we'll keep working on in the next few months. There was a second goal to this G20, food. You know, I mentioned that as early as March, last March, on the timelines of the NATO summit. The main risk of this war is the destabilization of food supply lines. Russia and Ukraine are very major on the grain and fertilizer markets, and this is why this destabilizes the world situation. On grains, because of the blockage of the Black Sea, there was a lot of fear, and we managed to bring some solutions and to make them more permanent with this G20. The European Union managed to open solidarity corridors, and so more than 15 million of grains were exported from Ukraine for the last few months. 60% of the grain produced in the region. There was another agreement made this summer with the United Nations, and to date, more than close to 10 million tons were exported since August. So since April this year, food prices have decreased again, and we are finding ways and means to secure regular ways to exit grains. Russia was about to endanger that mechanism, leading to a hike in grain prices. But the G20 sent a clear message to President Putin. A lot of work, a lot of technical discussions took place within the sponsorship of the UN Secretary General. The agreement on grain in the Black Sea will be extended at the end of this week. There are various technical issues that were reviewed, and so we have perspectives to keep up that work. So our perspectives can be extended, and various paths which we opened will enable us to export grain as we've been doing since August. On fertilizers, we've made progress since the strategic meeting that we had in New York last September. We, during the Paris Forum last week, there was a World Food Agreement, and so there is a new corridor for food to be and fertilizers to be exported to Africa from Russia. The first shipments will take place next week, and France will bring a financial contribution, 7.5 million euros. This is part of the emergency plans that we decided upon last September. Over the last few days, Russia stated that it wanted to set up new taxes on fertilizers exports, but the G20 sent a clear message here again. It would be irresponsible to do that. And here again, we made a very clear decision to increase the transparency through the G20 mechanism, EMAS, that was instituted in 2011, and that should bring more transparency on exports of grains and fertilizers. The World Trade Organization is to be commended on what it did and on its confirmation of what it announced a few months ago, and it clears many obstacles to exports of grains, food, and fertilizers exports. We had a meeting with the IMF, the World Bank, the African Union, and the EU to keep on improving those transfer mechanisms on the development of African production of sustainable fertilizers in line with the farm strategy which we initiated last March. This is the second main plank of this G20 on food, international food security, and there are clear messages and conclusions, and the sustainability of some mechanisms that might flow in a very practical way. The third main message from the G20 is solidarity with the South. This G20 had to be a solidarity G20, and the Indonesian presidency as well as the Indian presidency want the G20 to keep its promises. We said very clearly that the poorest countries should not pay the price for a war they didn't want. Since the Rome summit last year, we made a lot of headway that show clearly that the G20 can arrive at the practical results. You will remember, I hope you will remember, that in May 2021, France launched an initiative after the COVID pandemic to help the financing of African economies. With the IMF in November the year before, we launched an initiative to initiate SDRs, and we also set up an initiative to reinitiate SDRs from rich countries to countries that needed those, an equivalent of $100 billion to the most vulnerable countries, and in particular the African countries, but all poor countries. This was confirmed in May, and it was reaffirmed, and currently we are standing at $80.6 billion of SDRs that were reallocated. This is a practical contribution flowing from our initiatives, our capability to mobilize the international community, and in a very practical way, countries like Rwanda and so on could access IMF programs at very preferential conditions in terms of rates, duration, 20 years, and also easing dates, 10 years, but also in a capability to assist the most vulnerable countries. So we reminded everyone of its responsibilities to go from 80 to 100. Those who committed to 20% should go ahead with it, and those that are lagging behind should make up that delay. We also want to make technical improvements, and we keep on working on this with the IMF. I'd like to pay tribute to the IMF, to their mobilization and their inventiveness. We've seen the situation getting worse for developing countries and emerging countries. We want to go further. France committed itself with other countries to reallocate 30% of our SDRs or to make an equivalent financial effort. In the same manner, this G20 enables some advances on helping fragile countries in terms of solidarity. This finance program, we set up a common framework for managing debt. We managed to get a first historical agreement on restructuring between the Paris Club and emerging countries, especially on the Chad debt that was restructured. And the private debt was for that country was also restructured. And we implemented the framework that we had decided upon. We're going to keep that up, and we want to go several steps further. As I said in Sharm el-Sheikh, the multiplication of crises, the pandemic, the Ukrainian war, the acceleration of climate change mean that we have to go further. We need to send more finance to the south. We cannot request those countries to support multilateralism if we cannot meet their challenges. Now, on the basis of the results I just outlined and the discussions that we had during the G20, I announced that next June there will be in Paris an international agreement, an international conference on the new financial pact with the South. So there will be a progress report on SDRs, the goal of 30% I mentioned, and the ways and means to increase financial solidarity with the South, to advance with the commitments of international institutions. There will be a major meeting in spring. The G7 will take place in Japan. On that occasion, we can draw all conclusions, but clearly we have to leave the status quo for poor countries and mobilize the private sector for the climate, agricultural, and industrial innovation in order to meet those challenges. Within that new financial agreement, we should address the issue of climate instability. We want to address loss and damages at the heart of Sharm el-Sheikh. We are in a new climatic crisis era. We cannot ignore what took place in Pakistan over the last few months. And several intermediary revenue countries are facing this. Currently, there are no international financial rules that take on board those new standards. So we want to take on board climate vulnerability as one element that could trigger off specific financial agreements, mechanisms, so that those countries, under conditions that will be set down over the next few months, and there will be work taking place, which we agreed with the Prime Minister of Barbados, we will be able to lay down conditions to initiate those new mechanisms. On those 3 points, we'll work with our partners, the African Union, the Barbados, that's doing a lot on loss and damages, India, presiding the G20 next year, the US, that will have a major role to play on those issues to move ahead, and in coordination with the Japan that will chair the G7. In spite of the war, and that's my fourth point, this is a major point for this G20, we'll keep on making headway on climate and biodiversity. Those are key points. I said that at the G20, the COP27, because of war, we cannot step back from commitments by Russia. So this G20 was an opportunity to confirm and clarify climate issues. Since Glasgow, we haven't stepped back. We are still committed to the Paris Agreement goals, especially the 1.5%. So we have to step up in terms of national commitments. We made some headway in two ways. First, to leave coal behind. That should be our first priority. It is the first time that the G20, in a very clear way, has taken a stand on coal, on exit from coal. I reminded you of our strategy a few days ago in Egypt. This is our international priority if we want to step up on goals. Second clarification point, after the partnership on energy transition for South Africa, which we finalized in Sharm el-Sheikh, it is Indonesia that signed this kind of agreement on the sidelines of the G20. And France is committed as well with financing. And it was on the sidelines of Glasgow that we launched those partnerships to help emerging countries exiting coal. We finalized the agreement with South Africa. We have had a tour de table on the sidelines of this G20, so we are about to finalize this work. We also discussed health during the G20, and this is to be about being consistent. We're just out of the pandemic, and we emphasized preventive mechanisms and preparedness to crisis. The fifth fund, we will contribute to that fund to the tune of $50 million. Also, transferring technologies to vulnerable and emerging countries. In 2021, we set up one of those mechanisms to transfer RMN vaccinations to Africa. I supported President Ramaphosa on this. The G20 confirmed this and confirmed international financing. So solidarity on health, prevention strategy that was confirmed, especially on finance institutions, mechanisms. We confirmed the commitment on international taxes, and this is an example of several initiatives that France has launched for the last few years. So, in spite of tensions and divisions, multilateralism and the protection of peace are still prevailing because it is in the interest of everyone. Russia didn't want to be isolated with this de facto majority. So, going beyond negotiations over the last couple of days and the days that preceded with our Sherpas, Russia should hear our clear message sent by the international community and come back to the table of negotiations. This G20 has also shown that this world is being rearranged. This is a questioning of our own international institutions, and so we should reform those financial institutions, and that should start next year. But we should go even beyond, and that's why France supports the full integration of African Union to the G20, which is a key component of that new deal. If we want to display solidarity with the South, we need to have the African Union at this table of negotiations. This is what I wanted to say by the way of concluding the G20. I would like to pay tribute to the Indonesian presidency, President Jokowi, for his work, for his welcome, for hosting us, and for carrying not just this message, but also very clear headways towards more unity, a more effective unity at the end of this summit. And I'm now willing to answer your questions if you have any. First question. Good morning. Regarding the missile that struck the Polish land, we understand that we have to be cautious in terms of where it comes. The Americans mentioned Ukraine. Russia said they did not send it. We also heard President Zelensky saying that was a message from Russia to the G20. So do you have any information? And can you elaborate on this? I don't have further information sent to me by President Zelensky. I talked to him, but I know more or less what you mean. I more or less, we more or less agree on the information. Yesterday, that was a terrible day for the Ukrainian people. More than 85 missiles landed on the Ukrainian soil, on civilian targets, on civilians and civilian infrastructure. So that's a very clear message. When there is a setback, a military setback in the field, there was a more aerial aggression. So that was a terrible day for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. in that context, there were those two missiles that landed on the Polish land with victims. And I'd like to still against our condolences to the Polish people. Currently, we cannot say where those strikes came from, so I'll be very cautious. I know what happened in Ukraine, and then there were two missiles that struck the Polish land. We don't know where they came from. There's some work that was shared by the US, but we have to remain very cautious. And so our staff is working in conjunction with the British and the Americans and the Poles to explain what transpired, and when that will have been clarified, we will have, as a group, to communicate in full order in the right venue. So that there's a fact. There were more than 85 missiles that were certainly sent by Russia to the Ukrainian land against Ukrainians. Two missiles landed in Poland. Now we have to clarify what took place, but we have to display solidarity and be ever friends of the Ukraine and its people. And this shows very clearly the risk of destabilization carried by that war. You mentioned those massive strikes by Russia on Ukrainian land. Did that take place during the first day of the G20? Or did you see that as a provocation by Russia vis-à-vis the main leaders of the world? Do you still want to talk to President Putin? And what issues will you raise? Look at facts. I'm not sure it's a provocation vis-à-vis the G20. Even though that were the case, it wouldn't change the nature of what happened. Though it's about the victims and the damages that are terrible. It's been several weeks that we've seen an intensification of strikes by Russia on Ukraine, especially since the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Donbass bore fruits. So we are very firm in condemning this. We condemn the change in nature, this change of nature. I said that a few weeks ago, the targets are civilians and civilian infrastructures. And that goes way beyond the disputed lands. That taking place during the G20 doesn't change anything to the seriousness of what Russia did, but it should not either change anything to our will to build peace and to bring everyone to the table of negotiations. So I'll confirm, every time it is useful, France will keep on discussing clearly with Ukraine, as we did with the President, but also with Russia. Let me say this again, and I've seen it. More and more people are coming to that stand. We must leave no stone unturned to help Ukraine resist. And that's why on the 13th of December in Paris, there will be two meetings. One conference on civilian Ukrainians in Ukraine, rebuilding civilian infrastructure to spend winter, and an economic conference for businesses. We should also help Ukraine to resist, to defend itself militarily, to stand up to that war from a humanitarian viewpoint. We always said there should be a negotiated end to that war. So France should keep on talking to Russia, and that's what we're doing.
If you may state your name and media, please. My name is Patrick Winter from The Guardian. Russia and the Chinese presidents have both said they have the Chinese and Russian presidents have both said they have a partnership without limits. In your discussions with the Chinese president, did you urge him to set some limits in relation to Ukraine that go beyond him indicating he's not in favor of a nuclear escalation? And did you have any success in that endeavor? And related to that, do you think if China did say something more, it would have an effect on Russia?
There are two key components for China. And they also mark a limitation.
Il est connu depuis
the first one has been known
une déclaration que nous avons faite en format dit P5 en janvier dernier, c'est-à-dire les 5 membres permanents du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, dont la Chine. C'est une condamnation très ferme de l'utilisation du nucléaire, de quelque forme que ce soit.
In any
Et donc la Chine
manner.
a toujours mis cette
So
limite.
China has always
Donc
set
cette limite
that
a toujours
limitation.
prévalu.
That limitation was always there
La deuxième,
right
c'est que
from
la Chine a constamment
before
rappelé,
the
nous
war.
l'avons
Second
largement
point,
évoqué hier, le
as
président
we said
Xi Jinping
yesterday,
a toujours été très
President
clair sur ce
Jinping
point.
was always
Elle appelle
very
à la
clear.
paix.
China always
cessez
called
le
for peace, for ceasing, for stopping that
Enfin,
conflict.
je
Finally,
constate que dans toutes les déclations qui sont faites par le
in
président
all statements
chinois
made by
et dans les
the
discussions
Chinese president
que nous avons,
and in
il y a un
the discussions
attachement
that we
profond
have, I see
et que je
a
sais sincère
clear
de la
and
Chine et de son
sincere
président
affection of
à
China,
la
its
charte des
president,
Nations
to the
Unies.
charter of
Et il
the
se trouve
UN.
que dans les principes de cette charte,
The principles
il y
of
a
that
le
charter
respect de l'intégrité
include
territoriale et de
the
la
respect of
souveraineté des États. Et
integrity
donc,
and
pour ces
sovereignty.
raisons, je n'ai
For
aucun
these
doute que ce
reasons,
sont des
I
limites au partenariat, parce qu'aujourd'hui,
believe there are no
c'est la
limitations
Russie
to that
qui
partnership. Currently,
parfois
it is
agite
Russia
avec une
that
certaine
occasionally
ambiguïté au sujet
is
nucléaire.
ambiguous
C'est la Russie qui a lancé
when
la
it
guerre,
talks
c'est la
about
Russie
the nuclear.
qui
It
a
is
violé
Russia that initiated
l'intégrité
war.
territoriale
It
de
is
l'Ukraine.
Russia that
Ce sont des limites assez
violated
robustes
the territorial
de ce
integrity of
partenariat.
Ukraine. So these are strong limitations to that partnership.
Je n'ai pas de micro. Donc
Mounia Daoudi pour RFI.
Vous êtes où?
Where are
Oui,
you?
vous aurez le micro aussi.
You
Pardon.
have a
Mounia Daoudi
microphone.
pour RFI.
RFI.
Vous avez évoqué la solidarité avec
You
les pays
mentioned
du Sud, la
solidarity
sécurité
with the
alimentaire et
South,
notamment la
food
reconduction de cet
solidarity,
accord
and the
céréalier.
extension
Est-ce
of
que
the
vous
grain
pouvez
agreement.
préciser
Can you
cette nouvelle
clarify
initiative concernant les
what are the
engrais?
new
Et
initiatives
est-ce
on
qu'il a été question
fertilizers?
d'énergie,
Did you
puisque c'est un
mention
fardeau important
energy?
pour les pays du Sud?
Is it
Et puis,
an
petite
important
question,
point
vous avez
for
rencontré
the
également Paul
countries
Kagame
from
à
the
plusieurs
South?
reprises au cours de ces 2
You
jours. La
also
situation s'est
met
considérablement dégradée dans l'est du Congo. Que peut faire la France pour une
the leader from Congo. There's been a deterioration of the situation in eastern
nous
Congo.
avons
What can France
Sur
do?
les engrais, à
On
peu près la même approche que
fertilizers,
sur
we
les
have the
céréales.
same approach as
La première
on
réponse
grains.
d'urgence, c'est de
So
sortir les
the
engrais.
first emergency
gaz
response
disponible, les composants
is
pour les
to
engrais,
export
pour que le marché
fertilizers
puisse fonctionner
and
normalement. C'est ce que nous
materials
évoquons.
necessary for
Nous avons réalisé
fertilizers
ces derniers
in
jours
order
avec le
for the
Programme
market
alimentaire
to
mondial.
plainly
Nous allons
work.
changer.
That's
Des
what we've
corridors,
done
exactement
with
comme nous
the
faisons pour les céréales. Pourquoi? Parce que
WFO. Corridors,
plupart
as we
des
do on
engrais
grains. Why? Because
qui ne sont pas
most
durables,
fertilizers are
dont
not
l'Afrique a besoin sur son modèle
sustainable,
agricole.
and Africa
Je
needs
le dis
those.
ici sans jugement de valeur parce que
This is not a judgment value.
à l'hectare que nous n'en consommons nous, en Europe.
Africa uses
stratégie
less
de sortie.
fertilizers
On
per
peut pas
hectare
demander
than
aux
we do
Africains, par
in
exemple, de
Africa.
sortir plus rapidement
So
que nous
we
et
cannot
de renoncer à leur
request
productivité. Il y a un
Africans
besoin de
to
développement.
exit
Donc,
this
il y a un
more
besoin
quickly
de gaz
and to give up the
pour pouvoir les
development
produire.
goals. So they need, there's a need of
Soit de
gases
composants, soit
to
de ces
produce
engrais
those fertilizers.
arrangés, soit
So
potasse, d'ammoniac.
potassium, ammonia, and so on
Réponse
is
première, ce que nous faisons
required.
avec le programme alimentaire
So what
mondial.
we do with the
On l'a fait depuis plusieurs pays, depuis les
WFO,
Pays-Bas
we've
et
done
depuis
with
l'Estonie. On va poursuivre
several
le travail depuis
countries.
d'autres pays baltes.
With
Sortir des engrais
Estonia,
pour
we're going to do
qu'on
it with
puisse
the other
retrouver le
Baltic
continent africain.
countries
Les
to
volumes qu'on a cités
export
quelques
those
jours vont vers le Malawi, par
fertilizers.
exemple.
For instance, over the last few days, we've had
Deuxième chose,
fertilizers
c'est de
sent to
pouvoir
Malawi.
accroître les
Second
capacités
point,
de
to
production
increase the production
substitutives.
capacity
Il y a des acteurs
for
qui existent.
substitution. There are
Il y
players,
a des phosphates, des acteurs européens ou
phosphates,
d'autres. C'est de permettre,
European
avec
players, and so
mobilisation des
on, so
financements
that we should
et
mobilize
capacité à produire plus,
financing and
produire
producing
davantage sur le
capability
court terme pour
to
faire face à
produce
cette
more
et
in
réduire
the
la
short terms
dépendance
to face
à la
up to that
Et
crisis
puis, le
and
troisième
reduce the
levier,
dependency
c'est
on
dans
Russia.
la durée de produire
Third
davantage
lever,
d'engrais sur le continent
to
africain
produce more
et évidemment
fertilizers in
de produire
Africa
au maximum des engrais
and to
durables,
produce
c'est-à-dire qui ne
mostly
dépendent pas
sustainable
uniquement
fertilizers that do not
de gaz
depend
naturel.
on natural
plusieurs modèles.
gases. There are several
Et
models.
donc, à cet égard, c'est très cohérent avec là aussi ce qu'on a fait sur les vaccins. Ça va être de développer
This is on the
des
same model as
centres
what
de
we did for
production,
vaccinations.
des hubs,
We'll
comme on dirait en bon
set
français,
up
pour aider à
hubs, production
consolider une
hubs,
production
to
africaine. Il y
consolidate
a des
African
capacités de
production.
production au Maroc, il y en
There
a au
are
Sénégal, il y en a au Nigeria.
capabilities in
Et donc, ce qui a
Morocco,
été décidé
Senegal, and
hier, c'est un
Nigeria.
travail
So what was
en lien
decided
avec l'Union
yesterday,
africaine,
we're going
le
to
FMI
work
et
in
la Banque
conjunction
mondiale,
with the
de
IMF,
cartographier
the
les
Union
besoins de
African
court
and
terme
World Bank.
pour les premiers
We're
et
going to
deuxième
map
volets,
out
et de cartographier
short-term
nos capacités de moyen
requirements
terme pour
and to map
développer
out long-term
dans les prochains mois,
requirements in order to
capacités de
develop
production.
over the
Et
next
donc,
few months
nous, le
those
financer, nous,
capabilities.
Européens.
with our financing capabilities and with the IMF and the World Bank. On energy, and there's a connection.
Est au fond plus large.
As I said, the federalization is broader.
La plupart
Still,
des pays africains
most African countries currently are fully hit by the cost of energy. They're hit on their production model.
Conséquences agricoles, d'autres productifs, mais ça frappe de plein fouet leur budget.
There's a clear hit on their budget because they have to draw resources to help out their population. So we need more money for the South. Many of those countries bear a budgetary pressure. They use the state budget to face up to this emergency. But there's a much greater financial vulnerability for those countries. So this is a by the way of preceding the initiative that I mentioned earlier. As regards the situation in Eastern Congo and tensions with Rwanda, as you know, last September, I brought together those two presidents on the margins of the General Assembly. I spoke to them over the last few days. I spoke to President Ruto, and I'd like to thank him for being so committed. There is a possible pathway for the region to start on the Nairobi process, which we support. So we're currently working with the UN to deploy regional forces with a lot of Kenyan troops in the short term, but several countries in the region said they were available in order to stabilize several cities, Bunagana in particular, and a few others, and to, in this way, to withdraw forces facing up, the M23, for instance, and to reinitiate the political process that should be the priority in order to manage those tensions. I know I can rely on the commitment of President Kagame and President Tshisekedi, and I'd like to thank very warmly President Ruto for his political commitment and sending forces, and France will keep on supporting his initiatives. One last question.
Il y a une question, alors je ne vais pas pouvoir tout faire.
Une question de Catherine de Canco, TF1.
Alors, prenez une question là et
one question there, and Iran, as I promised.
Oui, Monsieur le Président, oui, Catherine Gentil de Canco, TF1 LCI. Vous l'avez rappelé, en fait, la France depuis le début était pour une solution négociée concernant le conflit
wanted
en
a
Ukraine,
negotiated
qui avait valu d'ailleurs
solution
des
to
critiques
the
à la
Ukrainian
France parce que
conflict, and
certains
France
pays
was
considéraient qu'il ne
criticized
fallait pas
because
parler à
some
Vladimir
countries
Poutine.
said you should not
Aujourd'hui,
speak
notamment
to
après toutes ces
Putin.
rencontres
Currently, after meeting all those people within the G20, do you think this is a stance that is improving? And currently, we are coming on a more global basis to that idea of a negotiated solution. I believe that the only stance that can bring together the international community is that stance. It is the only one. And I feel gratified that several countries sent clear messages along these lines. On Ukraine, we'll have to reinitiate discussions. We have to be realistic and responsible. The pathway to negotiations doesn't mean that we should not resist. So this has to be expressed in a clear way. In the short term, Ukraine has to resist. They're so courageous. The resistance of its army and the international cooperation from Europeans and Americans are necessary. Without that cooperation, they probably would have been defeated. They are also defending both their own rights and international law. In the short term, we have to support them in resisting, but we should also build a pathway to negotiations at some point. The combination of those two planks have made some headway. There's more of a consensus on that stance that we always defended. That doesn't mean that we are between two stools, but we want to be clear that we have a clear stance and we want to talk to everyone. So war is taking place. We are not taking part in that war, but we want to prepare peace. And that seems to be the same stance as with the US, the UK, and Germany. It is also at the core of the discussions I had with President Erdogan, Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Modi. Those three will have a clear role to play. We've had long discussions with President Erdogan, who plays a very useful role.